As if on cue, no sooner than a couple of banks announced record profits this week than the Senate set up yet another inquiry into competition in the sector. And while the banks have shown a remarkable ability to shrug off the effects of the worst financial crisis in 80 years, politicians and their desire to rein in the banks' activities are a far more enduring issue. Neal Woolrich reports.
Order. The member for North Sydney has the call.
Australians want to know that they have a more competitive banking environment as a result of government action.
It seems that the global financial crisis for the rest of us has been a global financial bonanza for our banks.
Opposed by those. Order. Opposed by those.
'Tis the season for bashing banks, and the gloves came off again this week as politicians from all sides lined up to have a swing.
The banks at the moment are very profitable.
I welcome profits, but I love competition.
Just as Joe Hockey outlined a 9-point plan to put the heat on the banks, Nick Xenophon mustered the numbers to force a Senate inquiry into the industry. But already there are doubts over whether it will achieve meaningful reform.
There have been a lot of parliamentary inquiries, including over the last couple of years, and not many of those have addressed many of these substantial issues, and they haven't produced recommendations that have led anywhere. The inquiry is really to humour the coalition, which is newly bolshy on banking, and to some extent to humour the Greens.
We don't think it's particularly warranted, but we'll be participating enthusiastically. It's one of a number of inquiries we've had over the last 2 years, and if the Parliament wants another inquiry, we'll be part of it.
It's mostly about competition and fees and charges and so forth. Look, that's worth looking into, but I've been asking for another Wallace-type inquiry because I think that we really do need to go back to bare wood, as it were, and think again about the principles which underlie not just competition, but also stability and how we should be regulating the Australian system going forward.
Professor Ian Harper was part of the Wallace inquiry in the 1990s, which laid out the regulatory framework that's governed Australia's financial system for the past decade.
On the one hand, people get very angry about bank charges and fees and look at bank profits and think, how sort of anti-competitive all of this seems to appear to them. And yet, on the other hand, are the very first to be concerned when the financial system looks like it's unstable. They rush back to the banks.
One of the arguments pre the GFC was that these non-bank mortgage originators didn't have to hold as much capital, and therefore their model could be different and they could play it different and there's higher risk. Now, a lot of those disappeared, so maybe that argument was true, but it is a delicate balance between promoting competition and actually making sure it's a fair game for everyone who's playing, but more importantly, it's a fair return.
Now, what we've also seen is actually a lot of competition between the major banks. They've cut fees very deeply over the last 2 years. They've passed back to consumers about $500 million in fees just in the last year. So we are seeing clear evidence that there is intense competition in the market.
However, banking industry analyst Ian Rogers says Australian banks need to get their own houses in order.
To my mind, the real issues in banking are around their productivity and their efficiency and just the cost of providing services to businesses and the public, and those costs are too high and there's not enough effort within the industry to bring those costs down.
It's not broken.
He says part of the problem is that Australian banks are trying to appeal to different audiences, appeasing politicians and the public by talking down their profits, while on the other hand presenting their results in the most favourable light to investors.
The return on equity in banking is only around 13 to 14%, depending on the bank, and even that's a generous number, depending on the profit number that you use. And the banks will always say that they're seeking to earn a return in the order of 18 to 20%.
If they were massive profit generators, you would see their price-to-earnings ratio go up massively and then correlate and correct themselves back. We haven't necessarily seen that over time.
One of the most contentious issues of recent times is whether banks are justified in raising their mortgage rates above and beyond any change to the cash rate by the Reserve Bank. While an army of economists continue to debate that point, there's little support for Joe Hockey's suggestion of greater pricing control over interest rates, even from his own side of politics.
This is just another one of their, as I said, lunatic fringe type ideas.
I'd be very surprised if that was to happen. I think that we have gained a lot over the last nearly 30 years of deregulation, and I would be surprised to see Australia go back to a more closed economy.
This is a problem of the bank's own making. We have not explained how banks fund themselves.
I think any attempt on the part of the government to regulate interest rates would be a grave mistake. I think we learned those lessons absolutely clearly during the 1980s. They ended up making the banks less competitive. They ended up with the banks being less equitable.
One suggestion that has garnered cautious support in Canberra is a so-called People's Bank, set up with taxpayers' money and distributed through Australia Post outlets. But the Bankers Association says that too would be a risky move.
We've seen the consequences with state banks failing, taxpayers having to bail them out. It's another one of these very dangerous ideas that's being floated around. And I have to make the point, I mean, none of these ideas are warranted when people can't actually substantiate the concerns that they're expressing.
But in this openly hostile political environment and with a finely balanced parliament, there's every chance that sound policy might have to give way to populist measures.